So I thought I'd talk about something completely different, which is a set of issues that have been the subject of work that I've done mainly together with Vidar Christiansen from the University of Oslo, where we've been working essentially on theoretical papers looking at the potential and problems of combining multiple instruments in environmental policy. I think when you talk to non-economists about environmental policy instruments, there's a kind of natural tendency to think that perhaps economists are rather too focused on prices, rather too focused on the idea that a carbon tax might solve all problems, that setting the price for carbon is the only thing we need to do, and that it's perhaps, to non-economists, obvious that what we should do is not just have a price on carbon, because we can't really trust that to do everything that we want, but we should pile on top of that a whole series of other interventions in the hope that a big enough pile of instruments will cover all of the gaps and all of the inadequacies of any of the individual instruments, and that maybe we can trust a policy that uses multiple instruments rather more than we can trust a policy that uses a single instrument. Now, to economists, that often feels a rather strange view, and I think certainly I very much share the view that if we can get the price right for carbon, we're getting a long way towards the solution. And I certainly share the view that there is no way of tackling problems of global climate change without a significant role being accorded to pricing carbon. I think the alternative of trying to do this without pricing would involve excessive and intrusive intervention in many aspects of economic life in a way that would undermine the efficient functioning of the market economy. So I start from a position where taxation should have a major role to play, and the question that really I'm looking at here is to what extent and when one might want to supplement taxation with other possible instruments. Now, if we look at this from the perspective of economics, the literature on taxes and regulation typically is a literature that thinks of these things as alternatives. Most of the discussion of the merits of economic instruments is a discussion which takes the view that economic instruments are better than command and control because they offer the potential for reducing the overall costs of pollution abatement. And that literature is one really where the question is either or. Do we have command and control, or do we use pricing as the basis for our interventions? In practice, of course, we see real-world policy taking a very different approach, where we have multiple instruments and simultaneously operating. And I think we need a rather better theoretical basis for understanding what happens when multiple instruments are used. We need to know rather more about what happens when instruments are used together, when can combinations of instruments do better than a single optimally set instrument, and we also need to think a bit more about the problems that can arise when instruments are combined in a policy package. Because certainly it's the case, and I think this is very familiar to all of us here, that when we use policy instruments together, the results can sometimes be unexpected. I think it's well understood, and has been a major theme in a lot of policy discussion within Europe, that in the context of a system of emissions trading, it's possible to, one can have a situation where the combination of emissions trading with another instrument which on its own might be perfectly effective, for example, a subsidy to energy efficiency investments, that combining that with a system of emissions trading, which might place a cap on aggregate emissions, immediately reduces the subsidy to ineffective, or makes the subsidy ineffective. that instruments that on their own might be effective become ineffective when combined with certain other instruments. On the other hand, we can also think of situations where an instrument which is ineffective on its own becomes powerful when used in combination. Imagine, for example, a subsidy to the cost of emissions abatement equipment, a percentage subsidy to the cost of installing some pollution control equipment, where if the firm does this, it gains no benefit in terms of, no appropriable benefit in terms of reduced energy costs. We're talking about pollution control of some other sort. And in that situation, halving the cost of abatement equipment still makes it something that, from the point of view of the firm, is not worth doing. If it's costly to begin with, then if it's half as costly, it's still costly and will not be undertaken without good reason, without further incentive. But if we combine that percentage subsidy to the cost of abatement equipment with an emissions tax, then all of a sudden the abatement subsidy becomes extremely powerful and typically would increase the elasticity of response to the emissions tax. So instruments used together can have combined effects that look very different from the effects that we get from instruments used on their own. Some water. Thanks. Now, there's a little general theory of multiple instrument regulation. There's one massive paper, of course, the paper by Robertson Spence, which follows on from the Weitzman analysis of price and quantity regulation under uncertainty. And the paper by Robertson Spence, it's well known, mounts a case for combined use of both quantity and price-based regulation, with one instrument essentially acting as a safety valve for the other, preventing outcomes that potentially otherwise would be extreme outcomes, and essentially ensuring that we don't move into territory where either abatement has to be undertaken at costs that ex post are excessive, or that we fail to take the opportunity of undertaking abatement that would be cheap and worthwhile in the light of experience. This literature, of course, is a literature that is well established and relates only to one particular set of circumstances relating to price and quantity regulation under conditions of uncertainty, and particularly uncertainty about marginal abatement costs. Beyond that, there's relatively little in the way of general literature on multiple instrument regulation. Looking back, of course, we can see plenty of we encounter the rather famous Tinbergen principle, the idea that we should have as many instruments as we have as objectives, a principle that I think has quite a degree of resonance, but is kind of slightly puzzling for someone who thinks that the objective of public policy is simply to maximize social welfare, which rather makes the notion of that underpins the Tinbergen principle a little awkward to implement. If one's objective is to maximize social welfare, it doesn't mean that we simply require one instrument. And it's clearly something that's rather more complicated than simply the notion of multiple instruments that determines how many instruments we optimally might want. And then there are papers on particular topics which implicit in them have an underlying theoretical model in which there is a case for multiple instruments. And one particular group of papers which I really like are the papers by Don Fullerton and Anne Wolverton, looking at multi-part instruments in which a tax together with a subsidy is used to achieve outcomes that are better, that can be achieved by either acting on their own. And various applications in that literature that Don and Anne have developed to do with waste management, to do with road transport in particular. What I've been doing in the work with Vidar, and what I'll be talking about today, is predominantly a development of the view that rests on the identification of imperfections in the instruments that are available. And it's a literature that, for both of us, we were very familiar with because of the extremely powerful paper by Agnar Sandmo in the European Economic Review in 1976, which looked at imperfect environmental taxes as a potential policy instrument. The idea that excise taxes could be used as a proxy for direct taxation of measured emissions, and that whilst that may have some practical advantages, it clearly has the drawback that the instrument is, to a certain extent, imperfectly targeted at the problem which it's trying to address. That paper by Agnar Sandmo, of course, died earlier in the year, having made an enormous contribution to many areas of tax policy, and including many areas of environmental tax theory. I think this paper is one of the most intriguing of Sandmo's many contributions. The idea that instruments are imperfect, of course, is much more fundamentally at the heart of quite a lot of our discussion about instrument choice. Indeed, the kind of static efficiency argument that we teach students, the argument for using taxes rather than command and control regulation, is in some sense underpinned by implicit assumptions about instrument imperfection. If we had perfect instruments, then we could achieve the same outcome through command and control regulation as we can achieve by using market mechanisms. There would be no limitation to the use of command and control to achieve the optimally differentiated pattern of abatement, taking account of the different circumstances of different polluters. And it's because we think that there are limitations to the use of command and control, in particular informational limitations on what can be achieved by command and control. Its inability to treat, to reflect optimally differences in the abatement costs of different firms, that there is a case for using economic instruments in the first place. So imperfection in instruments, or approximation in the impact of instruments, is actually very much at the heart of our instrument choice literature already. And we're really just trying to build on that notion in some of these papers on multiple instrument use. One could think, for example, of the literature or the kind of policy context that we're interested in as being one where we might think of European countries that levy high taxes on motor fuel to discourage motoring externalities, but simultaneously they also have other instruments on vehicle emissions, on driving speed, on access to city centres, restrictions on parking, and so on and so forth. So we have a panoply of regulations in addition to high taxes on motor fuel, all of them to a certain extent directed at reducing externalities associated with motoring. And the questions we're asking really are, why is it that one might need to have both taxes and regulation in this context? And in particular, we're intrigued by the question of how the instruments interact. And perhaps we can focus that question most clearly by saying, well, supposing we take some regulatory initiative that tightens regulation. Supposing, for example, we ban diesel cars from city centres, what does this do to the optimal externality tax on diesel fuel? Does it reduce the optimal externality tax? Can we be sure it reduces the optimal externality tax? And what governs the way in which the optimal externality tax might be recalibrated when we've taken that additional regulatory intervention? In fact, when Vidar and I were thinking about this paper initially, it was just at the point when Norway and other countries were beginning to ban smoking in restaurants and other public spaces, and we were wondering what this did to the optimal externality tax on tobacco. And you can see exactly the similar sets of issues that potentially arise. And in this work, we're essentially looking at the combined use of imperfect taxes and regulation to address a simple, straightforward externality problem in the form of consumption externalities, typically generated by individual consumption behavior. And the kinds of imperfection that we're thinking about are, for example, situations where we can tax a good that's associated with an externality, but where the extent of the externality varies between consumers or varies between different consumption uses that are made of the commodity in question. So everyone pays the same tax on diesel fuel, and it's impossible to tax diesel fuel differentially for people who will drive in city centres and people who will drive elsewhere. So everyone pays the same tax on diesel fuel, but the people who drive in city centres clearly generate more externalities than others. And then we combine that with a notion of imperfection in regulation. Regulation clearly can't be perfect if the story is going to work, so we need to think about structuring the regulation in a way that creates a sort of interesting trade-off between the two. And the way which we thought was an appropriately general way of representing regulation is to think of consumption regulation as in some way increasing the real cost of acquisition or degrading the quality of the commodity that's consumed. So perhaps we impose inconvenience costs by limiting who's allowed to sell the commodity or the hours of sale. In Norway, for example, where Vidar and I was typically thinking about these issues, you can only buy alcohol from certain sellers and at certain times of the day. You could think of restrictions on where and when goods can be consumed, smoking in public places, driving in certain streets, and so on and so forth. And the key characteristic of these kinds of regulation is that they impose real costs by diminishing the utility that's obtained from consumption in defined circumstances. In addition to the cases where we're thinking about combining regulation of this rather soft sort, where we regulate by degrading the quality or imposing inconvenience costs on consumers, we also look at issues to do with the case where regulation takes the form of an absolute prohibition, an outright ban on consumption of some commodity in particular contexts. And one of the reasons that's interesting, of course, is that outright prohibition is much easier to enforce than pretty much anything else. As soon as you see someone performing the illegal activity, the prohibited activity, then you know something's gone wrong. And it's much, much easier to enforce an outright prohibition than any other attempt to limit the extent of consumption. To give you a bit of a flavour of where this literature goes, well, some of the answers are pretty obvious. So we have two contexts for consumption of the taxed good, and one of the questions we asked is which of those consumption contexts should be the subject of regulation, and the answer is neat and straightforward, and I guess kind of obvious, or seems obvious, but we demonstrate rigorously that where we're supplementing a Pigouvian tax with regulation, it's the consumption causing the larger marginal external cost that should be subject to regulation. So of the two consumption activities, the one we should regulate is the one that causes the larger marginal external cost. That sounds so obvious you might wonder why I've mentioned it. In a moment you'll see that there are cases, there are interesting cases where the alternative is true. We also ask the question, how does regulation affect the level at which the tax should be set? And typically, in most cases, the answer again is going to be the natural one, which is that stricter regulation will typically lower the tax rate that should be set. But it won't always be the case that increasing the stringency of regulation reduces the optimal level of pricing. And there are certain circumstances where, in fact, the tax should increase when regulation is tightened. These will typically be ones where if aggregate marginal external costs increase because of substitution towards the unregulated consumption component. If that happens and it drives up its marginal external cost substantially, then one might optimally want to increase the tax when regulation is tightened. And similarly, one might want to increase the tax when regulation is tightened if regulation makes the consumption with a larger external cost more price sensitive. And those are both circumstances in which you would get this apparently counterintuitive result that tighter regulation implies tighter optimal taxation. Looking at the alternative regulatory instrument, not simply a soft regulation that deters the regulated activity, but a hard regulation that prohibits the regulated activity. We can see that a ban, a hard regulation, essentially has three effects, and in some respects the consequences differ from the consequences of the soft regulation. First of all, if we ban the consumption activity, if we ban one of the two consumption activities, it effectively eliminates the external cost associated with that activity. That has the implication, of course, that it means we can then set the tax so it optimally reflects the externality generated by the other non-regulated activity. And in that sense, we can target the tax more precisely to optimally control the externality from the other activity. But in addition to those two effects, we also need to consider the consequences, the welfare consequences of the ban itself, and the loss of the consumer surplus, net of the external cost from the banned activity, is going to be a further dimension that we need to take account of. And if that loss of consumer surplus is large enough, it potentially could exceed the gain from the first two effects. So even if activity A causes a larger externality per unit than activity B, we should ban the activity for which total external cost exceeds total consumer surplus. Of course, if total external cost exceeds total consumer surplus for both of the activities, then we should just ban both, and the story becomes uninteresting. But the interesting cases are those where one of the activities, only one of the activities is the case that total external cost exceeds total consumer surplus. And that's the activity that we should ban, irrespective of whether or not that activity has the larger marginal external cost. And in that sense, we're getting a result that's very different from the prioritization result that we saw with soft regulation. Soft regulation will always target the activity with a larger marginal external cost. A ban, however, doesn't necessarily do that. And sometimes it could be more efficient to ban the less damaging activity. In another strand of work, we've looked at some aspects of environmental regulation under uncertainty. And here we're looking at the arguments for using environmental taxes together with other instruments. Given the time, I'll not talk about this in detail, perhaps refer you to a paper where we've discussed some of these issues, a paper in Environmental and Resource Economics in 2015, and you perhaps can follow that up at some stage later. I think to wind things up, I think there are a number of prescriptions that follow from the work that we've done, or prescriptions that follow from thinking about the case for multiple instrument regulation. I think, first of all, and most importantly, the case for multiple instrument regulation is something that needs to be made rather than assumed. All instruments are costly to operate, and that's true both for the regulator and for polluters. The regulator, multiple instrument regulation, requires the regulator to incur the costs of operating multiple instruments, and for the polluter, typically it requires costs that are of compliance, which are going to vary or going to increase the more different types of regulation that the polluter is subject to. So without good reason, the presumption should certainly be against multiple instrument regulation. And I think very much the economists' allergy to multiple instrument regulation, I think, is something that we should bear in mind, that there needs to be good reason for piling instruments one on top of another. But good reason can come from the recognition that most of the instruments we have at our disposal have some element of inefficiency, some element of imprecision in the targeting. And that's the case both for most of the feasible tax instruments that we can think of, and also the case for most of the feasible forms of regulation that we can describe. Instruments typically are not going to be perfect and not going to be perfectly targeted, and a key role for multiple instrument regulation is going to be to offset the weaknesses of one instrument by deploying another that in a package can be used to achieve a better outcome than either instrument operating on its own. But that requires a very clear identification of a problem with the instruments and an appropriate solution. Just piling instruments one on top of another isn't necessarily the right thing to do. And in particular, optimal policy instrument combinations can turn out to be counterintuitive. So I've given you a couple of examples of how that can be so, and the existence of these results means that optimal policy is actually going to be quite difficult to design and to maintain. There are, I think, serious issues that we need to address and think much more closely about that are raised by the use of multiple instruments. And I think we can't naturally assume simply that adding further layers onto an existing structure of interventions will naturally make things better. Anyway, let me leave you with those thoughts, and thanks very much once again for the invitation to talk to you.